So oftentimes you'll just simply use a plugin provided by the CakePHP community and never have to modify it. But other times you might need to make tweaks and then refer to your package that you've hosted on your GitHub. So this is going to just show how to fork a package and then use it instead of the one that you'd normally get from Packagist. So this package that I'm going to use to demonstrate forking a package or a plugin is Cake DC Users. It's a very full-featured users table with a heap of functionality to provide all sorts of different logins and permissions and those sorts of things. So it's a really good way to bootstrap up to a working authentication and authorization package. But let's fork it and then pretend that we're going to use the package that I've forked. So it's a simple matter of creating a fork, and then once you do that, you can copy the URL for the repository and check the documentation out for Composer, and under loading a package from a VCS repository, it just gives you the special changes that you need to make. So we'll do them one by one. So firstly, open up your Composer JSON file and look for, and see if you've already got a repositories key. If you don't, I'm just going to paste this URL in and grab the repositories key here, and then put that into here, and of course there, and making sure that's all correct. Okay, so we've defined a repository. Now we need to tell Composer what branch from this repository it needs to pull the modified plugin from. So looking at the documentation, it says you need to add, let's say you've a patched monologue to fix a bug in the bug fix branch, then you need to add the name of the package and dev bug fix. So what's the name of the package? Where does that come from? If we have a look in the repository from Cake DC Users that I've forked and go into Composer JSON here, the name of the package is this, Cake DC Users. So I'm going to copy that into my require block, and then the documentation says if you've made a change to fix a bug and you put in the bug fix branch, prepend dev dash to it. So in my particular case, I forked the repository and I just forked master, so I'm going to put dev master. And now let's see what happens when we run Composer install. And notice, although I've made these changes and saved the file, it didn't pick them up when I did an install. So I have to do an update, and what an update will do, it will loop through all these packages and check for the latest. But in this case, it will check the repository here and open Composer JSON and find a match between this and this repository, and then pull this one in preference to the one from Packagist. So just do Composer update, and then notice it's now installed Cake DC Users, but it's pulled in the dev master branch from my personal repository. So if we look in vendor, we can see that if we go into Cake DC, that package is now been pulled in. Now if I made any changes to my package, let's just imagine that let's go in and do maybe an edit. And save it, and then again do an update. Notice the hash will change for dev master, and you've now got a fully you're fully able to make changes to the package, and it will draw from there from now on. So that's something really helpful to know as you start to develop and then extend things to make them suit yourself. So that's overriding a package with your own updated package or plugin there. Now CakePHP has this concept of plugins, and if we have a look at the documentation, it says you can set up, it's almost a mini CakePHP application, very much the same functionality embedded in it, but a plugin allows you to reuse it in other applications and share it with the community, and that's, for example, what the Cake DC Users plugin has done. And so we're going to just create a plugin and then implement it and then share it to our GitHub again. So this has been Cake Bake plugin, and I'm going to call it the plugin lister plugin, and it says, do you want to? Now notice here that it's thrown an error. If we go back up to config and look at our app file here, and then we look under the app configuration namespace here, notice down here we've got app paths, and it's saying plugins are in the root with the directory separator and the plugin directory. But if you notice in my particular source code here, I don't have a plugins directory, so all I've done is just thrown an error because this a directory is missing. So I go make dir plugins and then try and run it again, and let's see if it works, and it says yes, it does. Now it asks to overwrite composer JSON, and you can just say yes, and that's not a big problem because it's not overwriting it or damaging it, it's simply adding a auto load directive so it knows where to find the plugin. So now we've got a plugin named plugin lister in here, and one of the things with plugins is that you have this concept of a plugin having web assets. So here we can see a web root directory, and when we run symlink, notice that it loops through all the enabled plugins and says, oh, okay, I'm going to link the Cake DC Users web root into the application web root so that it's available, and I'm going to do the same for debug kit and the plugin lister. So looking at our web root directory, we now have these symlinks, but clearly our plugin lister doesn't have any web assets, unlike debug kit and Cake DC Users. So what I'm going to do is just delete the plugin lister symlink that I created and delete the web root directory out of my plugin so that when I run it again, it doesn't try and share assets because I'm not going to use those. Now another thing it has is controllers and models and those sorts of things, so I'm not going to use those, so I'm going to delete that as well. And then go into the plugin file. So every plugin has this plugin.php file, which has a number of hook methods where you can hook into the parent application and provide the plugin functionality to the parent application. Now this one's got one that defines some routes or routes, and I'm not going to use that, so I'm going to remove it. And now I'm ready to create my plugin functionality, and all it's going to be is a command line application that I can share. So if I go cake, bin cake, bake, and then I go command, and this time I say, okay, I want to create a command in the plugin lister, and I'm going to call it get plugins command. And so that's created a command here, and we can now start to flesh out the functionality of it. Now, one recommendation from a video I saw, it was this CakeFest video. Why should you? I just stopped that because it auto plays. But basically, it said that it's a great idea to use utility classes to move functionality out of commands so that you can reuse them elsewhere. So how to reuse code with utility classes. So that's what we're going to do. So I'm going to create a directory, and it could be, you could name it service or utility or whatever you like, but I'm going to call it utility. And I'm going to create a plugin, because that's what we're going to do, list plugins, so a plugins class, and give it the correct namespace, which is plugin lister. And you can see the editor's auto completing that. Then I'm going to say the class is, and before I do that, make a mistake, it's actually in a subdirectory, so we need to specify utility for the namespace as well, and then it's plugins, and we've created our skeleton. And we're going to use a public function called get, and it's going to return an array of plugin classes. Now we're going to do this the long way, or a non-cake way to start with, and then we'll look at making it more cake-ish after we do this. Alright, so the first thing we want to do, if we're going to list all our cake plugins, they're usually located in our vendor directory, and we want to list all the active and inactive plugins. So how do we get hold of the vendor directory programmatically? Well, we can use another of the cake configuration files called paths, and it's got the cake core include path here that generally always includes the vendor because the cake core files go in there. So what I'm going to do is use this to get a reference to vendor, and you can look through this file and see all the different constants that are defined and that you can use in your application. Makes it very handy instead of resolving them other ways. So remember to use those if you need to reference directories. So we've got this cake core include path. Let's go to our plugins utility class, and we're going to, as we said, get a reference to the vendor directory. So we're going to use this, and then we're going to say, okay, so I want to go up 2 directories to take off the CakePHP stuff and just give us vendor. And we can also use this real path call, which should, if we dump and die, it should show us the path to vendor directory. Now before we can run this, we need to call it using our command. So I'm going to say, okay, it's going to return classes, I know that. So I'm going to say create a new, it's called plugins. We'll make sure that we get the correct plugin utility plugins class, yes, and then call get. So we've now linked our command to our utility class, and now we're going to just run the command get plugins. Now we can see that's worked fine. Now what happens if you want to rename a plugin command? Well, we can go to our, and you can see this in the tree here, the plugin file in the src directory of our plugin. So this plugin file allows you to make changes. Let's just specify that we're going to change the command to be more in line with the Cake plugin utility. So if we have a look here, we can see that it's plugin load, plugin loaded, or plugin unloaded, but it doesn't list all plugins. So we're going to list all plugins. I'm going to change the name of it to this, and then we're going to say get plugins command, and that looks right, and give it the class name there. Now let's again run bin cake just to see what it's done, and it's changed the name to now be the name that we want it to be. So from there, we are now at the point we've got to go into our utility class. Let's just close some of these other things, and we want to get the classes out of the vendor directory so we can see if they're plugins. So one way of doing that, if we have a look in the vendor directory, at the bottom of the vendor directory after the directories is the autoload file. So we're going to return for ourselves a reference to this class loader and then get the class map out of it. So now to do that, how do we do that? Well, let's firstly call this thing a class map, and we're going to require the vendor dir, and then it's auto load PHP. Now we're going to check that there was actually something returned, because if there isn't, we don't want to do anything. And then we're just going to say, okay, let's get a list of classes out of the class map. And at the moment it's not auto completing, so we might make a reference here for our editor to pick up on, and it's composer and auto load and class loader. So that will give us the type hinting we need, and once we've done that, we can then go get our, let's do get and get our class map. Now what does that return? Let's have a look. And it's a massive list of all the classes in our vendor directory. It's enumerated pretty much all of them. So now we need to have a look at what it's returning. We're not really interested in these paths, but we are interested in these class names. So we might change this to just be the array keys that are coming from this class map. So we've just got a list of classes, and then we're going to find the loop through these classes, and we might just not do this laborious typing. What we're going to do, just maybe copy and paste this in, but we're just going to loop through the classes and find any class that ends in plugin and is a subclass of the base plugin class, and we're pretty certain then that that's going to be a CakePHP plugin. Now just to make sure that anything that's returned, it'll be array even if it doesn't loop through, just initialize that. And now finally let's have a look at our children array as right. Now that's empty at the moment. Why is that? Well, it has to do with Composer not having compiled a complete class map, and you run this following command before you deploy your application. So there's no job for Composer to find everything, because it's already compiled into a nice list to return to the application. It speeds up the application. So first I'm going to change back to one of those constants, the root directory, which puts us in the same directory as our Composer JSON here. Then I'm going to run exec and do a composer dump auto load and optimize it. So now let's see what happens when we run it and run it again. And it takes a while for it to compile, but once that's done you could probably not use that again, but let's just run it every time. And so now we have a list of all the CakePHP plugin classes. So let's return that to our command. And in fact, we could probably do a little bit more here to format this. Maybe what we can do is create an array that will have all the information that we need to return to the command. So we want to display we're passing in each plugin, aren't we, class, and we're going to pass in these children. It's probably the wrong name for it, but that's what I've got at the moment. And so we might say, okay, we want to get the name of the plugin, new it up, and then just say, okay, use the get name functionality there. Then we've got another, we want to know, is it loaded or not? So in the Cake core plugin class, there's an isLoaded function. So it's saying we need a plugin string, so let's get the name that we've just pulled out of that class and say if it's loaded, just say yes. If it's not loaded, say no. And then finally, we can return, we're going to return three things. We're going to return the plugin class. Let's change that name so that it makes more sense. And then we want to say what's actually the name of the plugin, and finally a flag to say is it loaded or not. So let's say return that for display into our command. So we want to display that. How do we do that in a nice table format? We can use the IO object, and then we can pass in a request that we're going to use a helper, a table helper, and then finally we want to output our array of arrays. So let's see what it does. It's probably going to blow up, but we'll wait and see. Okay, class name must be a valid object or string, line 39, and that would explain if we got that correct. Let's try now. Yep, so now we've created our plugin lister plugin, and it's really it's really seems to be working, but is there a better way of achieving exactly the same thing? So it's showing us all the information we need. Actually, there's a little bit of a problem here. Let's fix that. And what we can do is we can do an array merge here, and we might pass in a heading array. So we want, one's going to be the plugin class, the next one's going to be the name of the plugin, and then the next one is whether it's loaded. And if we try that again, let's have a look. and it's blown up. Right, and so there's a reason for that. If we have a look at this that's working without it, we need to so we need to wrap the array in array to make sure it's a nested array. So we're just going to do that here and just say let's nest that together. Whoops. And now we have our working display of the loaded plugins. Now that does work, and it's a way of delving into the vendor directory using Composer, but in a lot of ways it's ignoring the fact that Cake has already done all this work for us. And you might have noticed that when I was scrolling into the vendor directory that CakePHP maintains a list of plugins already for us. So let's just re-implement our utility class to use with Composer, and we'll just rename this, and then might create another one. This time it's get, and it's going to again turn an array, but this time we're going to have a go at it a bit better. So one way we can do this with Cake is use a plugin collection. Now if anyone knows why this is really wrong, let me know, because I'm eager to learn when I'm making big mistakes. But this seems to work, and it uses Cake methods. So we just need to make sure that we pull everything in. Yep, so we pull that one in. And now we're going to get hold of the plugins because Cake already knows about them. So we're going to pull in using configure, and we're going to read the plugin setting. Now let's have a look at that right now and see what we're seeing. And that's what Cake's pulling in. It's basically giving us the name of the plugin and the path to it. So from there we can now go and loop through, and we don't need the values, we just need the array keys. So we're going to use that, and we'll call it plugin name. And now we're going to use our plugin collection, and there's a method here. We can just pass the name of the plugin to it, and it will do the work of grabbing hold of the plugin. Again, remember we implemented it so that it was, we want to know if it's loaded. So pass the plugin in, and we might grab the name there before and we might give this a name here, and I don't know if I'm doubling up on, probably the name's exactly the same as the name passed in, but we're just showing that we can now do methods on it. And then finally we want to say, okay, let's give ourselves the class name that we had before, so pass in the object, then give ourselves the plugin name, and finally whether or not it's loaded or not. And again we want to initialize display to be empty unless, so it doesn't And now finally, let's return that and see how it looks. Now remember, what will be being returned? Plugin class name and loaded, and just make a note of what said was loaded or not. And now try again. And now we have the same thing, but it's much quicker because Cake's already done all the work of getting all our plugins, all our plugins loaded and stored for us to use already. So that is creating a plugin. Now let's go to that final step of sharing it to our GitHub page and making sure that we give this to, maybe we can give it to somebody else. So I'm just going to go into the plugins directory and go git init and git add git commit, and we'll call it the initial commit. Now there's a lot of, you could do a git push and create a repository on GitHub, but there's a simpler way to do it in VS Code. So I'm just going to start a new window and jump into my that has, alright, let's attach VS Code, and it's just hopping back to where it was, so maybe there's a better way of doing that. Yeah, let's try this one. Open folder in container, that's the better one. Now what we've done is we've opened up the plugin lister plugin, which has got the GitHub repository we've just created, and when you're authenticated with GitHub, you can just hit the publish button and choose whether you want it public or private, and then it'll do everything for you. So there you go. So now we have our plugin lister. Now this is an issue here which you need to fix in order for it to make sense. So let's just do that now. Go back here, go into our README and change. Well, what we can do is let's just use this and just make that bulk change to our two things, to our composer, so it's got the correct name, and to our README as well. So let's add those to fixed plugin name and commit them and sync them up to our remote server. Right, so now let's switch back to our CakePHP project here and now make use of that. So remember again that we have our repositories. We need to specify the repository and the name of the package and give it the correct branch name. So maybe we can do that as well. Get a terminal here and say git branch fix name. We could just say, and maybe if I got that right, git checkout new branch fix me. Right, let's publish the branch and go back to our project, find composer.json, copy and paste our repository that's there, go to our plugin URL and just pop that in again here, and find our, if we just reload here, we'll see that it's probably waiting for GitHub. It's now changed to this, and we also have another branch here called fixed name branch. And so what we're wanting to do now is we want to specify, now it's a dev requirement, isn't it? So we'll put it in require dev, and now it says, okay, the documentation says you need to specify dev and then the branch that you want to pull from, and I think it was fixed name, wasn't it? Now notice we're actually in the wrong directory now. Let's go back to our root and go Docker. We're looking for Composer. Now if I hit Composer install, notice it just goes straight through and doesn't do anything. So what we want it to do is we want it to say go through your composer.json file and check for new versions. So it will loop through these two repositories and find the composer.json, find the name that's specified, and then match that name to this name here again. So if we go update, let's see what it does. So it's checking the remote repositories for the latest versions of things, and notice now that it's pulled in our plugin. So we now have in our vendor directory, if we look, a plugin from our GitHub repository instead of the one that we generated. So let's go into our plugins folder here, go into our plugins folder, remove the plugin lister that we created. In fact, we might just move that so that it's out of our web root. And we need to make a few changes here because this is a bit hacky, but we've also need to change our auto load because we no longer have that plugin installed. Now it's coming from our vendor directory. And then we probably should just do composer dump auto load, and spelling it correctly would be good. And now let's see if when we go bin cake, is it picking up our plugin lister from, let's see if it works. Yeah, it does. So we've really done the round trip of creating our plugin, uploading it to GitHub, referencing it in our composer.json, and then pulling it back down, and then just making sure that it's not going to be stepping over the top of the one we already created as a demonstration there. So I really hope that this has been helpful to someone.